Hello and welcome to Great Heights Training. This is the training for A1 Assessor course, and today what we'll be looking at the knowledge questions. As you probably must be aware by now, to complete your A1 Assessor training, part of that is to answer the knowledge questions which is set by the awarding body. There are 37 knowledge questions for the A1 training. The reason we are doing this course is on the knowledge questions is because we've had a lot of emails from learners expressing how difficult it is sometimes to answer what the knowledge questions really means, or what the awarding body really expects you to answer, which is normal because as a trainer myself, I would tell you that these knowledge questions are sometimes confusing. Most of them sometimes have the same answers. Some of them keep repeating themselves. Some of them, they are very ambiguous, so which means the answer can vary from the same question, different people might answer it the same way, but you don't need to worry about that because there's no right or wrong answer to those knowledge questions. It's about your own opinion, what you think it means, and what do you think you should do as an assessor in different situations. You are training to be an assessor, and you will have learners who will come up to you with different questions, or you will come up across different situations where you might need to take action or do different things, and this is what really those knowledge questions are, to kind of find out from you as a trainee assessor, what would you do in different situations? How would you respond to different circumstances? And what do you think you should do when a learner comes to you with different issues or different problems? Or when you come across difficulties, what should you do? Who do you go to? So these are really what the knowledge questions are. There's 37 questions, like I've said before. And what we will do during this course right now is to look at the questions one by one. I won't give you the answers as such because I would like you to have the opportunity to go through them and try and answer them yourselves. And any challenges you have, you can always email us, and then we'll speak to you more about it, or email you the answers, or email you guidelines. But really, this course today is about giving you explanation, explaining to you what the question is really looking for, what the question is really asking, what it really means, trying to translate the different questions that are said there, and also giving you guidelines on how to answer those questions and the general idea of what's expected of you as an assessor. And I hope that this will help a lot of you try to attempt answering those questions, and I'm sure you will do very well. A lot of them, a lot of the answers are already included in the previous lessons we've had and the handouts that you have already, and some of them, they are just very tricky. So I will go through them, and what we'll do is hopefully that will support you and help you in answering the questions. So let's go to question 1. Question 1 says how to identify and use different types of evidence when carrying out assessments. This question is related to assessment planning lesson that you must have done by now. And what the awarding body is looking at really is for you as a trainee assessor to explain how you would plan an assessment with your candidate. So which means the answer should have an element of what assessment planning is and how you would sit down with your candidate to plan their assessment. So you should really mention there, how do you plan the methods you would be using with your candidate to assess them. And one of that would be, you will make sure that you do a meeting where you go through the assessment planning with them. And so that element should be there in your answer. And another thing you would need to do here is also list the different methods of assessment, which is the assessment methods lesson, which you already have and that most of you already know. So this is what the answer is really, is for you to explain how you would identify the different types of evidence and assessment methods that you would need with your candidate. And this is what the awarding body really wants you to look at. If you know, they want to see your knowledge about assessment planning and your knowledge on assessment methods. So once you've got that, that is the answer for this question. Question 2 is how to identify and compare different types of evidence when making your assessment decision. So really here, it's a repeat from question 1 because you are expected to list the different types of evidence here. and which are observation, reflective account. These are the evidences that they are really talking about here. So your answer would list the different types of evidence, and you would also need to talk about how do you compare those evidences. What do you use as a guideline to compare those evidences? So really you need to look at the assessment planning again, where it talks about how it needs to be, which means it has to be reliable, authentic, valid, fair. So how you would compare evidences would usually be when the candidate brings those evidences to you, you would have a look at them, and you will need as an assessor make a decision on which evidences are valid, authentic, reliable, that can be used for the assessment. So this is one way of comparing evidence. And another thing you would also do is make sure that you do not duplicate, which means too many evidence that keeps covering the same criteria. So you don't want that. You want to make sure that your evidence vary and covers all the criteria. So this is what really the answer is looking for here, is the different types of evidence that you would use and how do you compare them to make your assessment decision. And you can also mention here that before you make an assessment decision on the evidences, you would always refer to the criteria set by the awarding body and make sure that those evidence match those criteria. So I'm kind of really giving you the answers here, but I'm sure you'll be able to write those answers out. And before we continue, one thing I wanted to also mention is when you answer your questions, it's what I would like you to know is IVs and EVs do not like one-line or two-line answers. So you are expected to explain your answer. An acceptable answer to an IV or an EV would usually be about 4 to 5 lines answers. So you need to answer in full sentences. You can answer as if you are the one being the assessor. So you can answer that as an assessor, this is what I would do. So you can answer in that way, or you can also answer like using a third person. The assessor needs to do this, 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 and this. So this is just to help you in terms of when you write. Make sure you use full sentences and be careful of the grammar and the spelling as well, because this is one thing they will also look out, and just make sure that you explain your answer in detail. So let's move on to question 3. It says how to collect evidence in ways that are cost-effective and timely. So really here, the key word is holistic, which means when you're gathering evidence, you try to do it at once. So which means if you're asking a candidate to write a reflective account, you will not tell them to write just for one unit. You will ask them to do it in a holistic way, which is they will be writing a reflective account based on all the units they are doing. So that's a way of doing it cost-effective and timely, so it takes less time. And so really here the answer would be holistic, but you need to put it in your own words, explain what it means, and also give examples of how you would do that. So I'm sure that question is an easy one. Nobody will have any problem with that. Question 4 is how to collect and use evidence from candidates' prior experience and achievements within the current assessment process. So again here, the keyword is APL, which is accredited previous learning, which is training that candidates have done before and they have certificates for those training. But you need to use that. That's a keyword here for the answer. And also make sure that when you write your answer, you explain how you as an assessor would go about making sure that that certificate is authentic and reliable. And again, you can refer to assessment methods handout to answer that question. And another thing is how do you collect evidence from candidates' prior experience? So which means here it will be really in terms of what they've done in the past, previous jobs they've done that's related to the training that they are doing, and that again would be something to do, it has to be on their CV, and it would also have to do in terms of when they write reflective account. They do not need to write reflective account only based on what they are doing at work now. They can also write reflective account based on what they've done in the past. So these are ways of collecting evidences from candidates' prior experience and achievement. So that's the guideline to answer that question. Question 5 is how to develop and agree assessment plans with candidates and the other people involved. So this goes back to assessment planning lesson again. And here what the awarding body is expecting you to do is to explain, show your knowledge of what an assessment plan is and how it is carried out with a candidate. So you need to explain here in depth the meaning of assessment planning and how it is done with a candidate, what are the things to take into consideration. And also here you would need to explain about when there are other people involved, such as a manager, if you have to go and observe at the candidate's workplace or get a witness statement from the candidates, what are the things you need to take into consideration when you are doing assessment planning, and how would you go about dealing with those different issues when you are planning assessment with your candidate. So which means, in terms, for example, getting permission for observation and agreeing, the manager agreeing. So these are the keywords here that you need to be able to answer question number 5. Let's move on to question number 6. It says how to accurately assess performance against specific parts of a standards. So here again, this question can be answered by looking at cross-referencing handout or lesson. So it's saying here, after a candidate bring evidence to you, as an assessor, how would you assess those evidences, and how would you make sure you assess those evidences against assessment criteria set by the awarding body? So this is what the question means, and you would really answer that question by talking about cross-referencing and how it is done before you make an assessment decision. So this is the guideline on question number 6. Question number 7 says how to take appropriate action and help candidates develop their competence. So really here it's more of a question of how do you work with your candidate to make sure that you are supporting them to develop themselves and develop their competence. As an assessor, you are there to show that your candidate is competent, but there might be areas that your candidate needs improving. So which means you need to show here how would you go about finding out if your candidate needs help, and how would you support them or help them to develop their competence. And really some of the keywords here is really asking candidates questions, finding out if they need any help, any support, probably encouraging them to talk to you more, and giving them tips or advice if you think that some things they are doing needs improving on. So it's really here having a really good rapport with your candidate. That's what will support you to be able to support them. And these are the different actions you would take to help a candidate develop their competence. You could also refer them to any training that you think would support them, or any materials or books. So it's different things like that, how you would take action to help your candidate. And this question doesn't have a right answer. It depends from people to people, which means as an assessor, you might have other methods that I don't have, and they are all correct as long as you, when you write your answer, you explain how the method you're using will support your candidate to develop their competence. Question number 8, how to change assessment procedures to meet individual needs of candidates. So here it also goes back to assessment planning, because it's during assessment planning that you will agree procedures and assessment methods with your candidate. And here it comes again where you need to talk about what and how an assessment plan needs to be, which is it has to suit the needs of your candidate. It has to be flexible. It has to be able to be changed to help a candidate, especially if whatever method you need to use is not comfortable with the candidate. So this is what you really need to talk about here, is assessment planning and how you make sure you agree everything with the candidate, and how would you go about changing. And what you need to also mention here, one other keyword, is if for any reason you have to change something that you have already planned to do with your candidate at an initial assessment planning meeting, and maybe down the line you need to change that, make sure that you update the initial assessment planning. Write a note on there saying that for some reason this had to be changed, or do a new assessment plan for the changes, and kind of cross-reference it to the first assessment plan where you plan to do that thing that you need to change, and explain why it had to be changed because of audit trail. So this is really what the answer would be here. Question 9 says how to identify the difficulties in making safe, fair, valid, and reliable assessments of evidences, and who to involve in such cases. Now this question is quite tricky because it's a long question and it needs breaking down. So what it's trying to say here, how do you identify difficulties you might have when you are planning assessment for a candidate or assessment of evidence? How can you identify difficulties, and who do you involve in such cases? It's not, the answer for that is not very complex. It's not a big answer. It's just, you need to just talk about how would you find out if there's any issues or any problem that might come up. For example, in terms of going to observe at the candidate's workplace. You might have a candidate who works in a workplace that's not very safe, especially if it's like, let's say for example, you have a candidate who works in a prison or works in a mental home where it's not safe for you as an outsider to come in. So this is one thing. And how do you identify those difficulties? The keyword here is at the initial assessment planning meeting. You would need to speak to your candidate, find out more about their work, find out more about them, and that any difficulties will come up then, and you will be able to deal with it. And who are the people you involve in such cases? Would usually be the center manager, who's the person who's employing you, or the IV. So this is just different points I'm giving you. I'm not giving you the full answer. I'm just telling you what the question means and giving you different key points of what to use when you're writing your answer. Question number 10, how to follow standardization and internal quality assurance procedures. Now, this is a question that I will refer you back to standardization handout and the lesson on standardization. And I'm sure if you watch the lesson and you read the handout, you'll be able to answer this question. But here the keyword is for you to explain that you know what a standardization means and what is done during standardization meetings and how you need to make sure that you follow the procedures agreed there and how you would do that as an assessor. Which means one example I would say is, this is just to give you an example, is during a standardization meeting, whatever assessment process is agreed, you as an assessor will need to make sure you follow that process and you do not do something outside of that process without permission. So this is just one example I would give, but I would expect you to answer that in more detail and explain your answer, and you can revert to standardization lesson before you do that. Question number 11, how to measure existing levels of competence. Now this question is quite, it's a question that's open, so which means any assessor will have different methods that they would use to measure existing levels of competence. But that would be something that the key here is for you when you're speaking to your candidate, finding out about what they do, what level they are on. So really it's asking you, how do you as an assessor find out on what level your candidate is? And I'm sure you'll be able to answer that question. It's really when you meet with them, what do you do with them? What do you ask them to find out what level they are on so that you can plan an assessment based on their level? So this is the question here. And one of the key things would be when you do an initial assessment meeting with your candidate, the questions you would ask them, finding out about any existing qualification they have and any existing experience they have. So I'm giving you some keywords here that you could use to write the answer for this question. Question number 12, how to make valid and reliable assessment of candidates' knowledge. As you know, NVQ is divided into two parts. There's the knowledge side and there's the performance side. Even though in the new year that would be changing because NVQ is moving to QCF. This is something you can read more about by going to the awarding body's website. I'm not going to deal too much on that, but what I'm saying is there's two different things you are assessing candidates on. You're assessing candidates on their knowledge and you're assessing candidates on their performance. So here the question is really, how do you make valid and reliable assessment of candidates' knowledge? So you need to mention here all the methods that you could use to assess a candidate's knowledge, and how do you make sure that those methods you use are reliable. So this is what the question is looking for. I'll just give you one example. One example of assessing knowledge could be question and answer. So how do you make sure that, what do you ask them and how do you make sure it's a reliable method? So this is question 12 and I'm sure you'll be fine with that. Question number 13, how to make valid and reliable assessment of candidates' performance. So this is similar to question number 12, but instead of knowledge now, you want to assess a candidate's performance. So what's expected of you here is to list the different methods you could use to assess a candidate's performance, and how do you make sure that those methods are reliable and valid. And I'm sure you'll be able to do that. Question number 14, how to make sure you have covered all the agreed criteria during assessment. Now this is a question that some of you might not be familiar with and might be difficult for some of you who haven't done an NVQ before. So it's trying to say here, as an assessor, definitely you are assessing your candidates based on assessment criteria set by the awarding body. Now the question really wants to ask you, how do you keep track of that? How do you know what criteria your candidate has already covered and what criteria they haven't covered? And how do you make sure that before your candidate completes, you check that they've covered all the criteria? So really here, the answer would be you having a good system of keeping record of everything you do with your candidate, and every time your candidate bring an evidence is making sure you cross-reference and tick off the criteria that that candidate has covered. And in NVQ, there's a sheet that is used to do that, which is called the matrix sheet. Now, that's something that I will send to you so you can use it, you can have a look at it as an example. The matrix list there's one matrix sheet for each unit, and it will have all the performance criteria of that unit. Maybe unit 201, performance criteria A, B, C, D until L. And then here what you would do is, next to each criteria, you will write what method you have used to assess those criteria. And if the candidate has met it, you will tick it off. And that will help you to see during the assessment process what criteria you've already ticked off and what criteria you still need to meet. So this is really what the answer for this question would be. If you have any further question, just make sure you email us and we'll get back to you on that. Number 15, how to check that the evidence is the candidate's own work. Now, this is something that is a very general question, and it will depend on assessors what they do. But one thing you need to talk about here is how do you go about making sure that the evidence that your candidates bring to you is actually their own work. Now, what you would need to explain is making sure that evidence is authentic. And what makes an evidence authentic is when it is signed and dated by the candidate. Now, another thing I would say is when you're answering this question, because there's not one way of checking this, because all you can do is make sure that the candidate sign their work. But there's something else, which is if candidates do their knowledge questions and they sign it, another way of making sure that that evidence is the candidate's work is you could ask them some questions. So you could do some question and answers with them on probably reflective account they've written, on knowledge questions they've answered. So these are ways of making sure you check that the candidate is the one actually doing those work that they are bringing to you. Question number 16, how to make sure that supporting evidences supplied by other people is reliable. Now here what we need to do here is give examples of different supporting evidences that other people would give. One of them would be witness statement. So these are just for you. You have to make sure you list the different evidences here and then explain how you would make sure they are reliable. And one way of it could be that make sure that it is signed and dated by the person who gives you the evidence. If it's a witness statement, it's always good from a manager. It's always good for it to be on a company letterhead. So these are different ways of making sure that you check upon evidences that's brought to you by a third party. So I'm sure you will have more ideas. So just think about how you would go about that as an assessor and just include it in your answer. Question 17, how to encourage candidates to consider and use their past experience and achievement. Now this is a question, if you look at what we've done before, we did a question on how do you use candidates' past achievement and experience, and in that answer we mentioned APL and experience, work experience that the candidate had before. So here the question is not how do you use it, it's how do you encourage your candidate to consider and use their past experience, because a lot of candidates, they might have done training before, but they might not tell you. They might have a lot of previous experience, but they might not tell you. So how do you make sure that you get that information from them and you encourage them to use it? This is what the question is. And one key thing would be making sure that you, when you meet with your candidate, find out about what they've done in the past and show them the advantages of using those things. And I'll give you one example. One of the advantage is if they've got experience in the past or they have certificates or training that could go towards their assessment, then that will mean they don't have to look for too much evidence because they've already covered a lot of criteria with what they have already done in the past, and which means their assessment can go quicker and it's less work for them and less work for you. So this is just how do you give them the advantages and show them the benefits of using their past experience and achievement and encourage them to use it. So that's question number 17. Let's move on to question 18. How to give constructive feedback on existing levels of competence and what candidates need to do to be fully competent. So here really is, if you refer to the handout on feedback, review and assessment decision, you should be able to answer this question. You need to talk about what feedback means and how do you give feedback to your candidate, how is it supposed to be done, where is it supposed to be done, and on existing levels of competence, which is on what the candidate is already doing, maybe on reflective account they brought to you, on an observation you did initially. And what do candidates need to do to be fully competent? So you need to be able to show the candidate what they need to do, which is you will look at the criteria that they've completed and show them those criteria, and then explain to them, which is agree with them, give them constructive feedback, and then agree with them what you think they should do to be fully competent, which means how can they show that they hit all these criteria. So this is again planning your assessment around those assessment criteria, and by looking at those different things you should be able to answer this question. Question 19, how to involve candidates in assessment planning, which is a very generic question again, and this is like how do you make sure that when you're planning your candidates assessment they are involved, and there's not a lot to say about that, and most people would probably say the same thing. I'll just give you keywords would be, when you're planning assessment with your candidate, make sure they always agree, get their opinions, ask them questions, make sure they understand what you've set for them to do, and let them know they can disagree, and involve them, let them know, let them give you ideas, because they know what they do at work and they'll be able to tell you more about how they can gather those evidences. So this is how you really involve your candidates in assessment planning. Question 20, how to keep to the Data Protection Act. This is a very general question, and here you would need to explain a little bit about Data Protection Act and how it is relevant to you as an assessor, and how do you make sure you keep to it and you protect information from candidates, private information, confidential information. So this is a very general question. You can do a little bit of research on that as well. If you go online and Google Data Protection Act, you can read that. You don't need to talk about the whole act, but just have a general knowledge of what it is and write down the bits that you think is relevant to you as an assessor, and explain how you would make sure that you keep to the Data Protection Act. 21. How to encourage candidates who have different levels of confidence and experience to take an active part in the assessment. So here again, you need to show in terms of how you as an assessor, you will work personally with your candidates, especially if you have some candidates who don't have enough confidence, some candidates who don't have enough experience, because you will be working with candidates. You will have candidates who are very good and who will move very fast, and you will also have candidates who lacks in confidence and experience. So now you need to talk about how do you encourage them. And here again, it's about having that rapport with them, being open to them, letting them know they can come to you and ask you questions anytime, and making sure that every time you plan an assessment with them, you let them take part in it. Let them know that their opinion counts. Let them know that those assessment planning that you're doing with them is flexible. If they're not happy, you can change it. So this is how you really work with them. You need to talk about you first meeting with them, doing like an initial assessment, finding out where they are, what their level of confidence and experience is. And how do you do that? Is by having a conversation with them, a friendly conversation, and then based on that, how do you make sure that they take part in the assessment? Is by communicating with them, letting them know their opinion count, asking them questions, getting their ideas, getting their opinions. So this is how you really do that, and that's how you would answer that question. And if you have more ideas, just write them down, because I'm only giving you some examples, and I'm sure you will have more to add to that. 22. How to use language and behavior which does not discriminate against any candidates. So here again, it's a bit related to number 21. You need to give examples of different situations where you might have candidates who have special needs, and how do you make sure that your own language and behavior does not discriminate against them? This is what the question is asking. It's a very general question. That question doesn't have to be answered by just a trainee assessor. Anybody can answer that question. If I will ask them in your workplace, how do you make sure that you do not discriminate against people using language and behavior. And one example could be here, you might have a candidate who doesn't understand English very well. How do you make sure that you communicate with them in a way that doesn't discriminate against them because they don't understand English very well? Another example might be, you might have candidates who are dyslexic. How do you work with them? You might have candidates who have problems. How do you make sure your own behavior does not discriminate against them? Because there are assessors who strictly don't like some candidates, and they show it. So how do you make sure you don't show that? And one key would be to make sure you are friendly with them, make sure you are open with them, make sure you take their needs into consideration when you are dealing with them. So I'm sure you'll be able to elaborate more and answer that question. 23, how to meet the different needs of candidates. Again, very similar questions. Here you need to talk about the different special needs that candidates might have. Try and give some examples, and how do you make sure that you meet those needs. And also mentioning that your assessment planning, again, is key here. How would you do your assessment plan to meet the needs of those candidates? So here it's very general again. It's about how do you meet the needs of candidates. How do you do it? How do you identify their needs is one thing you need to talk about. And how do you make sure your assessment plan taking those needs into consideration? And that's the answer to this question. Question 24, how to give feedback to candidates with different levels of confidence and experience. Now, this is like similar to question number 18. It's similar to previous question. It's exactly really similar to question number 21, which is here you need to talk about the different types of candidates that you might have and how do you give feedback to them. And really here you need to mention about constructive feedback and sandwich feedback, and making sure that the feedback that you give them doesn't discourage them, making sure that the feedback that you give them doesn't kind of make them feel really bad of themselves. So that's what you really need to answer here. Talk a little bit more about that. Number 25, how to encourage candidates to ask questions and get advice. Now, this is a very broad question again, and I'm sure you will be able to answer that. How do you encourage your candidate to ask questions and get advice? It's by prompting them, really. That's one keyword, prompting your candidate. When you meet with them, you will see them, you know them, you will see if they look a bit different or they look like they are confused. So you need to be able to approach them friendly, speak to them, and let them know they can ask you questions anytime. And also, for them to get advice, let them know who are the other people they can get advice from if they're not happy with your assessment decision. And that again goes back to having an assessment plan, which is the induction one, when you talk to them about the people involved in the assessment and about the appeals procedure. So always talk about it so that candidates, they know if they're not happy, they don't need to keep quiet. There's somebody else they can go and speak to. If they want a second opinion, they can always go and speak to somebody else. So this is how you encourage your candidate, really, in that sense. Number 26, how to monitor and review progress with candidates. So this is really a very general question again. You need to now think as an assessor. You are an assessor, you've got a candidate. How do you monitor your candidate's progress? How do you review their progress? So again here, it's about one key thing would be about having different review meetings with them where you look at the work they have done and giving them feedback. And how do you monitor them is probably by giving them a call once in a while, checking them up on them, sending emails, finding out about what they have done, getting feedback from them. Or if you want, you can also do like observation to see how far they've gone. So these are different, you talking about how do you monitor and review their progress, what are the different methods you could use to do that. There's not just one method, and I'm sure you will have more ideas on other methods I haven't mentioned here. So that's what your answer should really look at. Number 27, how to identify changes in levels of candidates' competence and assess how this affects your own competence. Now, I would understand that first time you look at this question, it's confusing. It's a bit tricky and you're not sure how to go about it. But first thing is, it's always good to break questions into pieces. So break the questions down and try and ask and look at them separately. So how do you identify changes in candidates' level of competence? That would be, think about it. That would be reflected in the work that they give you. It would be reflected in the observation that you carry out. It would be reflected in the way candidates start speaking. So you need to look at the different methods, different things that will show you that your candidate has increased in their level of competence. And so that's answering the first part of the question. Now you look at the second, how does this affect your own competence? So really this is a question that's very personal, so everybody will probably answer that in their own way. But the key here is really looking at For example, if you're working with a candidate and the more competent your candidate gets, the more progress they make, it shows that you are very competent as an assessor. It does affect your own competence. It shows that you as well, you are increasing in competence as an assessor. And for example, if you have a candidate who hasn't improved at all and they are still the same, then it doesn't mean you are a bad assessor. It just means you might need to review some of the methods you are using for that candidate. So this is what your answer should really look at. So try and break down the questions, make it simple, and try and answer it separately. And then you can put your answer together at the end. Question 28, how to use opportunities to update your skills and experience. Now again, I'm sure a lot of you will know how to answer that question. How do you make sure as an assessor you are always updating your own skills and your own experience? And some of the keywords here would be attending training, reading magazines, subscribing to online material, attending standardization meeting. So these are just different things of how you can your own use opportunities. Whenever you hear of a training, it's good to attend because that will help you. Whenever you hear there's a standardization meeting, you make sure you attend because you get updated information, going to different websites. So this is a very broad question and there's so many things you could say here. Question 29, how to identify and use information on current assessment best practice. Here again, this part is really trying to see how you as an assessor would go about developing yourself. So these questions, that's what it's really looking at. How do you make sure you have a plan for your own personal development? One thing that I would like to mention at this stage is there's something called continuous professional development. It's called a CPD. What a CPD does, it records all your track record as an assessor, your experience as an assessor, every training you've attended relating to your assessment area or you being an assessor, any standardization you've met. So CPD is something you will need to keep a record of everything you do to develop yourself as an assessor. And that's what this question is, how do you identify and use information? So first of all, let's look at how do you identify information. It's really by reading a lot, by researching a lot, by going to websites, and by asking questions. Now, how do you use those information is every time you hear of something, just make sure you update yourself. You hear of a training, you attend it. You hear of a new book coming out, you buy it and you read it. You hear of a meeting set by an awarding body, you attend. So it's just really, these are the different ways of using information on current assessment best practice, how to identify and use those information, and making sure that those information, when you get them, on up-to-date information. When you have a meeting, you can always contribute in the standardization meeting and give ideas of new things that you've learned, new things that you've heard, and try and start talking to the center where you work, giving them those ideas and supporting them to implement those best practice, and trying to implement those in your own assessment methods as well. So that's how you answer this question here. 30, how to use personal development opportunities to improve your assessment skills. So again, these are all related, so it's kind of same answers again. How do you use personal development opportunities to improve your assessment skill? So personally here, you could go on a course, you could attend training, you could subscribe to online material, to newsletters, buy books, read books, do more research. This is what this is really. These are all the words you would use to answer this question. 31. How to meet candidates' needs for access to safe, fair, valid, and reliable assessment in line with legislation. So this question here is a bit tricky. So we'll break it down. First, it says how to meet candidates' needs for access to safe, fair, valid, and reliable assessment. So which means how do you make sure that your candidate can access, the way you assess your candidate, how do you make sure that it's safe, fair, valid, and reliable? So here it's really about national standards and fact external. So it's not just within what you know, it's what's acceptable out there. It's even over candidates that you might not be working with. So how do you meet the needs of those candidates? It's really by you yourself making sure you understand and you are aware of the legislation as an assessor. That's one thing to mention in your answer. You need to make sure you understand national standards, you understand legislation with regard to safe, fair, valid and reliable assessment. You understand the bottom line. And once you understand that, you make sure that you use them, you apply them in your assessment planning so that your candidate can access those safe, valid, fair assessment methods. So you need, the answer here is, make sure that as an assessor you understand national standard, you understand legislation which is relevant to fair, safe, valid, reliable assessment, and make sure that every time you plan assessment with your candidate, you make sure you are working in line with the national standards, you are working in line with this legislation, and that's how you get your candidates to access those type of fair assessment, valid, reliable assessment methods. So it's a question that's a bit tricky, but that would be the answer here. 32 is how to recognize and challenge unfair discrimination in assessments. So here really it's not just about you as an assessor. You might be working with other assessors and you might notice that one of your colleagues is not really fair with their candidates. Maybe there's unfair discrimination like the question says. So how do you recognize those and how do you make sure you challenge them? So this is what your answer should be. Now how would you recognize it? Is you would see the way the assessment methods is the planning of the assessment. So really by looking at the assessment planning that your colleague has done with their candidate, or maybe candidate might speak to you about it, you would know what methods they are using and you would know that that candidate, that method is not really suitable for them, and based on that, this is how you recognize those unfair discrimination. And how do you challenge it is you need to be very diplomatic here, because you don't want to fight with people, you don't want to be the one who's always creating problems for your colleagues. So what you would do here is, first thing is, I'm just giving you my opinion here because this question is really your own personal opinion of how you would go about something. So here my own personal opinion would be, if it's your colleague and you're working with them, it's always good to go to them first. Speak to them about it, find out maybe they are not aware of the needs of that candidate, and try and help your colleague to be able to suit the needs of their candidates. But if it's continuous and you see that the colleague is not changing, that's when you have to go to the center manager, who is the employer, who is the one in charge, and then they will know how they will deal with that. And if you go to the center manager and they don't do anything about it, you could go to the IV. If the IV doesn't do anything about it, then the higher you could go would be the ED or the awarding body directly. But I don't think there's any situation where it will come to that extent. It's just, first thing is just a friendly chat with your colleague and addressing what you've seen and how you think they should change. And if it doesn't stop there, that's when you go higher. So this is really how you as an individual you would tackle that issue. Number 33, who to get advice from about meeting candidates' special assessment requirements. So this question here is, you have candidates who have special needs, and here you need to talk, if you're not sure about how you would go about meeting their needs, who do you need to speak to? Who are the people you need to consult? And the key people here would be center manager or the IB. And sometimes, if both of them need to go higher, then they could go directly to the awarding body. But you as an assessor, the first person you would speak to is your center manager or your IB. And that's what the question here, and that's what your answer would be. You need to talk about the different needs that candidates have and who would you talk to about them. How to identify and plan for issues of confidentiality and data protection during the assessment process. Here again, it goes back to data protection, and here you need to talk about, during assessment process, candidates will bring evidence to you, so you need to mention how those evidences could be confidential information or could clash with data protection. So that's what you need to talk about here. And then you give examples, if you want, of different work products or evidences that your candidate might bring that you think is confidential, and how would you go about identifying them and planning for them. And really here you need to mention that it is done at the initial assessment planning meeting. When you do assessment planning, you would know what type of evidence or work products your candidate will bring, and you will tell them beforehand, whenever they have confidential information, what they need to do, which is, if for example there's a letter with personal details of somebody, they need to black out the personal details of the person before they bring that letter to you as a work product. So these are just different information, like in health and social care plan. They need to make sure they black out confidential information before they bring it to you as a work product for evidence. So it's just looking at different things that your candidate might bring to you. Find out how it affects confidentiality and data protection, and how do you make sure you plan for those issues during the assessment planning meeting, which you need to make sure you mention. 35, how to record, store, and pass on assessment decision to other people within an agreed system. So here it's talking about you having candidates. It's just looking at the different stages. You have candidate and you have your candidate's portfolio that you're working on. How do you record assessment decision? Because I'm breaking down the question now. How do you record assessment decision? One thing would be assessment decision is recorded on the review feedback form that you have, because there's space there where you have to say whether the candidate is competent or not and explain. So this is where it is recorded, and any other documentation that you might have to record that information, you will write it down there. Now, how do you store that information? So you need to talk about storing information in a safe place, making sure it's not accessible to just anybody. So you need to talk about that here. And how do you pass on assessment decision? Now you need to first talk about who are the people you need to pass on assessment decision to within an agreed system. You would have the candidate. How do you pass on assessment decision to your candidate? So here you would mention when you have your review meeting with them, you're giving them feedback. That's where how you pass information to them. How do you pass on information to the center manager, whether it's by email or by letter or by telephone? How do you pass on information to the IB? The IB will get the portfolio that they need to have and sign off. So this is how you pass on information to the IB. So really, it's about how do you pass on information, how do you keep track of what you are passing on, and how do you make sure that every time you submit something, get the person to sign to show that they've received it for protection, because you don't want them to come back and say they never received it. So this is what you need to look at here, the system, the process of information, how it's recorded, how it's stored, and how it's passed on to different people. 36, how to identify and assess things that can influence your own competence. Here it's how do you identify things that can influence your own competence? Now, first of all is for you to list what are the things that can influence your own competence. Things that could influence your own competence could be if you are judgmental towards a candidate, maybe personality clash. If you don't like a candidate, that might affect your own competence with that candidate. And things that can affect your own competence might be some units that you are not very familiar with. It might be standardization meeting that you do not attend. So list those different things that can affect your own competence and explain how do you identify them and how do you make sure that it doesn't happen. So try and talk about that more here on question 36. I've given you 3 different things and you can add more to it. How those things can influence your competence, and how do you make sure that you identify them at an early stage and deal with them so it doesn't happen. Number 37, which is the last question, how to identify appropriate sources of support for your own development. So this now again goes back to previous questions that we've looked at. How do you support yourself to develop personally? We've looked at using books, we've looked at attending training, we've looked at subscribing to online articles, magazines, newsletter. So it's the same thing really here, how to identify appropriate sources of support. So how do you do that? Is one thing could be by doing a lot of research, going on awarding bodies website. They always publish support materials and training there. So give more ideas of how would you look for support as an assessor. If you need support, where would you go? How would you go about doing it? This is what your answer should be here. So this is the 37 question for the knowledge questions. We've looked at all of them, and I've given you some tips on how to answer them. I've explained some of them. Some of them I've given you answers practically to them. And I'm sure now you will be able to go and start answering those questions. And remember what I said, they have to be answered in full sentences, at least 5 sentences, at least 5 lines. No 1-line answer, no 2-line answer, because they are not very detailed. And through those answers, you need to be able to show to the EV and the IB that you have good knowledge of an assessor and the different issues that you might come across and different circumstances and how you would go about dealing with them. So you need to be very detailed in your answers. If you have any questions while you're trying to answer the knowledge questions, just email them to us and we will get back to you with more information. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time for our next lesson.